Nearly 2 decades between January 1982 and November 2001, police in Washington state pursued an elusive predator who stalked and murdered young girls and women along the seedy SeaTac Strip, a stretch of highway between Seattle and Tacoma, known for its dimly lit motels, truck stops, and a hidden world of desperation. Detectives dubbed this phantom the Green River Killer, named after his favorite dumping ground, the cold, winding waters of the Green River. In the end, authorities would blame him for the deaths or disappearances of 49 women, but many believe the true number is far higher. And even though a suspect would later confess and be imprisoned, the case still leaves behind disturbing mysteries and unanswered questions. In September 1982, legendary FBI profiler John Edward Douglas, the man who inspired the hit series Mindhunter, took a crack at building a profile of the Green River Killer. His 12-page assessment painted a chilling portrait: a white male from a dysfunctional family who murdered for power and control over women. Douglas said the killer likely lived a rugged lifestyle, unemployed, perhaps homeless, with an addiction to alcohol and cigarettes and a passion for the outdoors. He imagined a man who hunted by day and stalked women by night. The truth, however, would prove far more mundane and far more horrifying. When the killer was finally unmasked in 2001, the public learned he had held one steady job for over 30 years. He didn't smoke, he rarely drank, and when he did, it was just a light beer. He didn't work out. He wasn't a survivalist or some drifter in the woods. His only outdoor activity was hunting women. The stress of the case nearly killed Douglas. In December 1983, while visiting Seattle to consult on the investigation, he suffered a near-fatal brain hemorrhage. The Green River Killer had claimed yet another victim, this time without even touching him. The first known victim, according to published reports, was Leanne Wilcox, a 16-year-old girl from Tacoma. Her body was discovered strangled in a field near Federal Way, just 8 miles south of Seattle, on January 1st, 1982. But the randomness of her murder made it hard for detectives to link her to anything larger. For nearly 2 years, her case sat cold before she was officially acknowledged as one of the Green River victims in November 1983. Another early victim, Amina Agashev, aged 36, vanished on July 7, 1982. She was initially listed as a missing person, not a homicide. Her skeletal remains wouldn't be recovered until April 1984. Police initially believed the killer targeted only prostitutes, but as the bodies piled up, a more disturbing truth came into view. The killer also had a taste for runaways and hitchhikers. Victims as young as 15 years old, girls just trying to escape a bad home or get to the next town, all of them were vulnerable. All of them easy prey. Denise Bush, 22, disappeared on October 8, 1982. Her skull was later found in Oregon on June 12, 1985, hundreds of miles away. But her body? That wouldn't be found until February 1990. Just one day after Denise vanished, 17-year-old Shonda Summers also disappeared. Her remains were identified in August 1983. In late October, the killer struck again. This time, it was 18-year-old Shirley Sherrill. Her bones were found nearly 3 years later, in June 1985. On December 2, 1982, Rebecca Marrero, just 20 years old and a friend of another victim, Deborah Estes, was last seen alive. She would never be seen again. Just weeks later, Colleen Brockman, only 15, vanished on Christmas Eve. Her remains were discovered in a ditch, 20 miles south of Seattle, on May 26, 1984. But the first officially recognized victim of the Green River Killer was Wendy Caulfield, a 16-year-old girl who had gone missing from her foster home on July 8, 1982, Her body was pulled from the Green River 7 days later. Then, Giselle Lavorne, 17, disappeared on July 17th. Her body was discovered on September 25th. The river continued to give up its secrets. On August 12th, 23-year-old Deborah Bonner was pulled from the water, just a half-mile upstream from where Wendy Caulfield had been found. 3 days later, the killer made a grim statement. On August 15th, police recovered 3 more victims from the river: 31-year-old Marcia Chapman, 17-year-old Cynthia Hines, and 16-year-old Opal Mills, all reported missing since August 1st. By 1983, the killer showed no signs of slowing down. On March 3rd, Alma Smith, just 19, picked up her final trick on a Seattle street. Her skeletal remains would later be discovered alongside those of Terry Milligan, another victim, in April 1984. A few days later, on March 8th, 17-year-old Dolores Williams vanished. Her body was recovered on March 3, 1984. April brought a deadly flurry. On April 10th, Gail Matthews, 24, was murdered. Her body wouldn't be found until September 18th. 6 days later, Andrea Childers, 19, was taken. Her remains were recovered on October 11th. The very next day, April 17th, the killer struck twice. Sandra Gabbert, 17, and Kimmy Kai Pitzer, 16. Their bodies were found in 1984 and 1986, respectively. On April 30th, Marie Malvar, just 18, vanished. Her case would go cold for 2 decades, until her body was finally discovered on September 29, 2003. The police, now fully aware of the scale of the problem, were overwhelmed. Leads were thin. The killer seemed to vanish after each murder. He left behind no forensic evidence, no witnesses, just silence and bones. In late August 1982, 2 more 17-year-olds, Case Lee and Terry Milligan, went missing. Milligan's remains were identified on April 1st, 1984. On September 15th, Mary Meehan, 18, disappeared. Just 5 days later, Deborah Estes, 15, also vanished. Their skeletal remains would be discovered together. May of 1983 proved equally bloody. Carol Christensen, 19, vanished on May 3rd. Her body was found just 5 days later. That same day, Joanne Hovland, a 16-year-old girl newly released from a juvenile detention facility in Everett, went missing. She's never been found. On May 22nd, Martina Authorly, 18, disappeared. Her body was recovered on November 14th, 1984. And the list goes on. On May 23rd, 18-year-old Cheryl Wims vanished without a trace. One moment, she was a part of the city's forgotten rhythm. The next, gone. Her body wouldn't be found until March 22nd, 1984. Nearly a year passed before anyone knew what happened to her. Like so many others, she had been discarded in silence, far from the life she once knew. By the end of May 1983, the killer struck again, claiming 2 victims on the same day. 19-year-old Yvonne Antosh and 15-year-old Carrie Royce disappeared on May 31st. Their fates remained unknown until months, even years, later. Antosh's remains were found in October 1983. Royce wasn't discovered until March 1985. October brought a fresh wave of horror. On October 11th, 25-year-old Mary Bell was murdered. Her body was found the very next day. Just over 2 weeks later, 16-year-old Pammy Event became the next target. She was killed on October 26, 1983. Her body surfaced months later on February 14, 1984. The pattern continued into November. On the first day of the month, the killer took 26-year-old Kimberly Nelson. Her skeletal remains were found nearly 3 years later, on June 14, 1986. Then came December. 26-year-old Yates vanished just before Christmas, on December 23rd. Her body was eventually recovered, closing out another deadly year. In January 1984, law enforcement responded with urgency. A task force was officially formed to investigate the Green River murders, but their presence didn't slow the killer. It didn't even seem to bother him. If anything, he grew bolder. On January 24th, Patricia Osborne, a 19-year-old sex worker, was reported missing by her family. Her name wasn't added to the Green River victims list until February 11th. Just days before that, on February 6th, 16-year-old Mary West was abducted while walking to a neighborhood market. Her skull wouldn't be identified until September 1985. Then came Cindy Smith. At 17, she was the last confirmed victim of the original Green River spree. She vanished on March 21st, 1984. Like the others, she disappeared without a sound. What tied all these murders together wasn't just the method, but the ritual. Like Ted Bundy before him, the Green River killer used specific dump sites over and over again. At least 8 locations were identified. Police monitored them closely, but the killer continued to return, often slipping past unnoticed. Many of the bodies were partially concealed under branches and brush. Several were laid beside logs, carefully positioned as if part of some twisted ceremony. Medical examiners uncovered shocking details. Small pyramid-shaped stones had been inserted into the vaginas of some victims. To this day, no one knows what they meant. In one especially macabre case, a dead fish had been draped across a woman's thigh, a grotesque symbol left behind by a mind teetering between rage and ritual. There were moments when police came painfully close to catching him. On April 83, Gail Matthews, a young prostitute working the SeaTac strip, got into a pickup truck. Her boyfriend watched her leave, unable to stop what came next. Her body was later found near Star Lake on September 18th. He gave police a description of the vehicle, but it was vague, too vague. 3 weeks later, another chance slipped away. On April 3rd, 18-year-old Marie Malver was working the same stretch of road. Her pimp, Robert Woods, watched her get into a dark pickup truck, one that looked eerily similar to the one Gail Matthews had entered. He followed the vehicle for several blocks, but lost it at a red light. Marie never came back, but this time, someone didn't let it go. Marie's father, Jose Malvar, took Woods' description of the truck and began searching. Incredibly, he found a vehicle matching that description parked in front of a house in Des Moines, Washington. He called the police. Detective Robert Fox arrived and questioned the man inside, a quiet, soft-spoken man named Gary Ridgway. Ridgway denied everything, calm, confident. The detective believed him, no arrest was made, and the bodies kept appearing. On June 8, 1983, 23-year-old Constance Naon was reported missing. Her remains were found in October. Just 4 days later, 27-year-old Kimberly Reams was abducted. Her body was recovered the following afternoon. On July 19th, Kelly Ware, 22 years old, disappeared. Her remains were recovered on October 29th. Another young woman, Tina Thompson, 22, missing on July 25th. She was found dead on April 20th, 1984. Then came 17-year-old April Buttram. She left home on August 4th, 1983, and never returned. Her remains were eventually found, but not until 20 years later, in 2003. September brought more names to the list. On September 5th, 26-year-old Debbie Abernathy disappeared. Her skeletal remains were found on March 31st, 1984. Then, on September 12th and 28th, two 19-year-olds, Tracy Winston and Maureen Feeney, vanished. Their bodies wouldn't be recovered until 1986. By spring of 1984, detectives revisited the Ridgway file. It turned out he had a history. In July 1980, he had been arrested for choking a sex worker, but the charges were dropped. In May 1982, he was arrested again for soliciting sex from an undercover cop. That charge also disappeared. Finally, on May 7th, 1984, Ridgway agreed to take a polygraph as part of the Green River investigation. The results, he passed. Police cleared him as a suspect. Later, Ridgway would brag about how easy it was. "I just relaxed and took the polygraph," he said. "Didn't practice or anything. Just answered the questions. Whatever came out, came out." The test would eventually be ruled invalid, but by then, it was too late. Authorities had already moved on. Then, in November 1984, a survivor stepped forward. Rebecca Guay had been 19 years old in November 1982 when she accepted $20 from a man in a dark-colored pickup. He told her he'd recently been arrested for soliciting sex and just wanted company. But instead, he drove her deep into the woods and tried to strangle her. Somehow, she escaped. She didn't report the incident for 2 years, but when she finally did, she was shown a photo lineup. Without hesitation, she picked out Gary Ridgway. Ridgway admitted to choking her, claimed she bit him, claimed he panicked. He also admitted to paying her for sex. Police questioned him and let him go. Again. The killer was hiding in plain sight. Calm, soft-spoken, cooperative, and lethal. And the Green River kept giving up its dead. Washington, 1960. Gary Ridgway's family settled into McMicken Heights, a quiet suburb just a short drive from the roar of Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. On the surface, they were a typical working-class family. But behind the white picket fences and trimmed hedges, something far more sinister was brewing. Gary Leon Ridgway appeared to be a courteous, even likable boy, the kind you'd barely notice. But teachers found him slow-witted, emotionally flat, and struggling in school. He was 20 years old when he finally graduated high school, and by then, the darkness inside him had already broken loose. In 1963, at just 14 years old, Ridgway committed his first known act of violence. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and without warning stabbed him. The knife tore into the child's liver, nearly ending his life. As the little boy lay bleeding and gasping for help, he looked up at Gary and asked a question no child should ever have to ask. "Why did you kill me?" Ridgway paused, then calmly wiped the bloodied blade on the boy's shirt. "I always wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody," he said. Then he laughed, loud and wild. As he walked away, his head cocked in the air like nothing had happened. Miraculously, the child survived. But no one ever connected Gary to the attack. He wasn't arrested. There were no consequences. And just like that, a killer was born. The years that followed brought no signs of reform. In August 1970, Ridgway married a high school classmate, but their union crumbled quickly. When he discovered her infidelity, he branded her a whore, a word that would soon become central to his violent obsessions. The irony? At the very same time, Ridgway was regularly paying sex workers on the side. Their marriage ended in divorce by January 1972. By December 1973, Ridgway had remarried. This time, the couple had a child, a son born in September 1975. For a brief moment, it seemed like Ridgway might embrace a normal life. But instead, his behavior grew more intense. He became what many described as fanatical about religion. He dragged his family to church multiple times a week. He led door-to-door prayer walks in the neighborhood. His wife would often find him sitting in front of the television with an open Bible on his lap, crying, seemingly overcome with guilt, or maybe something else. By 1980, the marriage collapsed. They separated, filed mutual restraining orders, and eventually divorced. Ridgway retained visitation rights with his son. At work, things were oddly stable. For over 32 years, Ridgway worked in the paint shop at Kenworth Truck Company. He won awards for perfect attendance and was known by coworkers as dependable, if a little quiet. But his private life? That was something else entirely. He was sexually ravenous. Partners reported that he demanded intercourse 2 to 3 times a night, and he never stopped seeing prostitutes. Some of his girlfriends, including the woman who would become his third wife, said he had extreme tastes: bondage, anal sex, degrading rituals. things that pushed far beyond the norm. On Christmas Eve, 1981, Ridgway confided in his then-girlfriend, Sharon Hebert. He told her he had met a woman on the street and had almost killed her. He gave no details. Sharon never asked questions. But shortly after that conversation, she stopped seeing him. In July 1982, Ridgway did something truly chilling. He was driving with his 7-year-old son when he picked up a woman on the SeaTac strip. He drove them to a wooded area, then told his son to stay in the vehicle. Gary and the woman disappeared into the trees. When he returned, he was alone. He told his son that the woman had decided to walk home. That was the end of it. That same month, 3 Green River victims were killed. No one knows for certain who the woman was, but police have long believed she may have been one of the missing. Despite the risks, Ridgway took calculated steps to cover his tracks. He knew how to confuse a crime scene. When one of his victims scratched him in a struggle, he clipped her fingernails to eliminate forensic evidence. Then, in a moment of twisted brilliance, he poured acid over the scratches on his own arms to mask the injury. He planted misleading items near his victims' bodies: gum, cigarette butts, even an Afro-style hairpick, meant to suggest a black suspect or implicate the victim's pimp. In another case, he left motel brochures by a corpse, then dropped her ID at SeaTac Airport to create a false trail. Ridgway even went so far as to call pimps after killing their girls, pretending he wanted another date. Feigning ignorance, playing innocent. In January 1984, Ridgway drove to a suburb outside Portland with his son. In the trunk, the remains of Denise Bush and Shirley Sherrill. He dumped them both in the woods, then mailed a letter to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, filled with red herrings and false leads. It worked. The task force was diverted to Oregon for months, chasing shadows. By early 1986, the FBI believed they had their man. But it wasn't Ridgway. It was Bill McLean, a trapper from Riverton Heights. He matched the profiler's image: white, outdoorsy, quiet. He didn't smoke, didn't drink. He had never used a prostitute. But when agents came to arrest him on February 6th, McLean greeted them with a chilling line: "What took you so long?" Despite the ominous start, their case fell apart. His house revealed nothing. He passed multiple polygraph tests. Eventually, McLean walked free and later sued King County and a local newspaper for defamation. A month later, the agents turned their attention back to Gary Ridgway. On March 20th, 1986, they requested another polygraph test. At first, he agreed, but on advice from his lawyer, he backed out. The FBI closed his file, but the local task force wasn't ready to give up. On August 19th, 1986, they officially reopened their investigation into Gary Leon Ridgway. Detectives began interviewing his ex-wives, former girlfriends, and past flings. What they heard was disturbing: violence, disease, sexual deviance, all centered around a man with an unquenchable thirst for prostitutes and a suspicious fondness for pickup trucks. They began tailing him, hoping he'd lead them to a fresh kill site. But their surveillance was sloppy. No one was watching on October 17, 1986, when Ridgway murdered 19-year-old Patricia Barzak. No detectives were there in February 1987, when he kidnapped and killed 21-year-old Roberta Hayes. 2 months later, detectives had finally had enough. They secured a full warrant to search Gary Ridgway's home, his person, his vehicles, and even his workplace locker at Kenworth. Detective Matthew Haney, in his affidavit, wrote the following line: "It is highly probable that Gary Leon Ridgway is the Green River Killer." During the search, technicians swabbed Ridgway's mouth for DNA. They plucked hairs from his head, chest, and groin. They seized his clothes, his tools, anything that might tie him to the victims. They even brought in a backhoe to dig up his backyard. But it was all for nothing. Aside from a single pamphlet about marijuana, there was nothing. No blood, no bones, no bodies. And Gary Ridgway, the most prolific serial killer in American history, walked free again. In 1988, as Gary Ridgway courted and eventually married his third wife, science quietly advanced in the background, but not fast enough. At a forensic lab in New York, technicians attempted to compare his DNA to rape kit evidence collected from 3 victims: Marcia Chapman, Carol Christensen, and Opal Mills. But the technology of the time failed. The samples were too small, the procedures too crude. There would be no match, no breakthrough. And so, the case languished. Throughout the 1990s, the task force lost steam. Hope faded. Investigators began to wonder if their killer had died, or simply disappeared into some other hunting ground. Rumors swirled, whispers of unsolved prostitute killings in Missouri and California. Maybe the Green River Killer had gone national. Or maybe, just maybe, it was never one man at all. It could be 2, maybe even 3 separate serial murder cases, said Task Force Commander Robert Evans, reflecting growing doubts within the department. But the truth was far more chilling. The killer hadn't stopped. He hadn't moved. He hadn't changed. He was still in the area, still hunting. In March 1990, Ridgway murdered 31-year-old Marta Reeves. Her remains were found 6 months later. Then years passed in silence, until August 4th, 1998, when he struck again. Patricia Yellowrobe was murdered and dumped, like the dozens before her. Her body was discovered just 2 days later. Then came the moment no one expected. In September 2001, technology finally caught up. Using refined techniques that could process even the smallest degraded samples, the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab tested Ridgway's DNA again. This time, it worked. On September 4th, 2001, investigators got the result they had been chasing for nearly 2 decades. Gary Ridgway's DNA matched semen samples taken from the bodies of Marcia Chapman, Carol Christensen, Cynthia Hines, and Opal Mills. It was him. Sheriff Dave Reichert didn't go public. Instead, he formed a covert evidence review team on September 11th, the very same day as the 9/11 terrorist attacks. While the world turned its eyes toward New York City, Ridgway's case was quietly, meticulously being built in the shadows. 2 months later, on November 16th, Ridgway was picked up in SeaTac, not for murder, but for loitering for prostitution. Still, Reichert waited. He wanted everything in place. No more near misses, no loopholes. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Leon Ridgway was finally arrested and charged with the murder of 4 women. It had taken 19 years, but they had him. Now came the hard part, proving it. Police traced over 100 vehicles Ridgway had owned or used. Each one had to be located, searched, and processed for evidence. It was a forensic marathon. Every inch of Ridgway's life was re-examined. Every route, every relationship, every whisper of a lie. On December 5th, 2001, Ridgway was formally charged with 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. But the investigation was far from over. Reichert and his team reopened 80 cold cases, women missing or murdered since 1984. Their search even crossed international lines, leading them to British Columbia, where dozens of women had vanished from Vancouver's downtown east side. Some survivors claimed they'd seen Ridgway in the area, but that path went cold. The Canadian murders turned out to be the work of another killer, Robert Pickton. Back in Washington, the evidence mounted. Forensic teams recovered bone fragments from Ridgway's home. Microscopic paint flecks found on several victims matched those used at the Kenworth truck plant, where Ridgway had worked for decades. In March 2002, a friend from the 1970s came forward. He remembered Ridgway once saying, "Prostitution is a terrible thing, and there ought to be a solution." That solution was to terminate the prostitutes. And terminate he did. On March 27th, 2003, Ridgway's game was over. He dropped the act, the denials, the feigned innocence. He confessed, first, to 25 murders, then 48, then 60, and even more followed. By April 10th, he had led police to 3 sets of long-missing remains: Pammy Evant, April Buttram, and Marie Malvar, found between August 16th and September 29th, 2003. Each discovery confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Ridgway had killed far more than anyone knew. On November 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder. Even then, he struggled to remember them all. He killed so many women, police said. He had a hard time keeping them straight. Privately, detectives speculated the final tally might be closer to 70. Some said even more. But in the end, the numbers didn't matter. The lives were already gone. Then came Ridgway's final act, a statement to the court. A moment of reckoning before the families of his victims, before the survivors, before the people whose lives he shattered. His words were short, measured, almost hollow, but he spoke them just the same. Then he vanished behind bars, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No fanfare, no second chance, just the weight of 48 names, and perhaps dozens more, hanging silently in the air. One by one, they searched them for hair, blood, fiber, a drop of DNA, anything that might connect the past to Ridgway's present. And it paid off. 3 more murder charges were filed against him: Bonner, Caulfield, Estes. By March 27, 2003, something shifted inside Gary Ridgway. He gave up the lie. The mask of innocence he'd worn for decades cracked, and then crumbled. He confessed. First, 25 murders. Then, the next day, he admitted even more. A bargain was struck. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to help investigators find as many victims as he could remember. He led police into the woods, to forgotten ditches, to lonely ravines where time had swallowed bone and cloth alike. Between August 10th and September 29th, 2003, authorities recovered the remains of Pammy Avent, April Buttram, and Marie Malvar, women long lost to the shadows, finally brought home. On November 5th, 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder. Reporters called it historic. Prosecutors called it justice. But for the families, there were no words. Even then, the confessions kept coming. Media outlets spoke of 60 victims. Some investigators believed the real number might be closer to 70, maybe more. Police later admitted that Ridgway had killed so many women, he had a hard time keeping them straight. Then came the final chapter. In a hushed courtroom, Ridgway stood to make a statement. His voice was flat, his eyes downcast. There was no fire, no tears, no rage. Only this: "I'm sorry for killing all those young ladies. I have tried to remember as much as I could to help the detectives to find and recover the ladies. I'm sorry for the scare I put into the communities. I want to thank the police, the prosecuting attorneys, my lawyers, and all others that had the patience to work with me and to help me remember all the tragic things that I did and to be able to talk about them. I know the horrible things my acts were. I have tried for a long time to get these things out of my mind. I've tried for a long time to keep from killing any ladies. I'm sorry I put my wife, my son, my brothers, and my family through this hell. I hope they can find a way to forgive me. I'm very sorry for the ladies that were not found. May they rest in peace. They need a better place than where I gave them. I'm sorry for killing these ladies. They had their whole lives ahead of them. I'm sorry for causing so much pain to so many families. There were no outbursts, no catharsis, just the quiet sound of broken hearts, breathing through pain that never ends." Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. But the punishment didn't stop there. The court hit him with a $480,000 fine, an amount the state had no practical way to collect. On June 1st, 2004, Judge Richard Jones ordered Ridgway to pay $74,459 in restitution to the survivors and families of the victims. Some families were awarded as little as $300. Others received $6,500. But like so much else in this case, the gesture was symbolic. Few expected to see a single dime. Gary Ridgway's confession closed a bloody chapter in American history, but not without leaving a final, haunting mystery. He admitted to killing 42 of the officially recognized 49 Green River victims. He also named 6 other women, not on the original list. And yet, not one of the victims was personally known to him. 4 remain unidentified. 7 women, Amina Agashev, Joanne Hovland, Case Lee, Kelly McGuinness, Patricia Osborne, Kimberly Reams, and Leanne Wilcox, are still considered Green River victims, but their murders have never been officially solved. And Ridgway, well, he's never claimed them. Whether he forgot them, never knew their names, or simply chose to stay silent, no one can say for sure. But for the families left behind, the silence is deafening, and the river still runs cold. In the end, Gary Ridgway didn't look like a monster. He wasn't a shadowy drifter. He didn't lurk in alleyways or flee across state lines. He wasn't covered in tattoos or marked by scars. He was a man who showed up to work every day, a father who took his son to the woods, a husband, a neighbor, a quiet man with a clean record and a chilling secret. And that is what makes him so terrifying. For nearly 20 years, Ridgway prowled the streets of Seattle and Tacoma, hiding in plain sight. He hunted the vulnerable. He preyed on the desperate. And when he was done, he buried their names beneath dirt, branches, and silence. His victims weren't just numbers. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends, each with a story, each with a life that mattered. And though the case is officially closed, some names remain unsaid. Some families still wait for answers. Some wounds never got to heal. Ridgway now sits behind bars, swallowed by the same system that once failed to catch him. He will die in prison, alone, forgotten by most, but not by all, because for every unsolved case, for every woman whose name was never spoken aloud, there is still a voice that tells the truth, a voice that keeps the memory alive. And as long as that voice echoes, the river may run quiet, but it will never run clean.